The bedchamber is silent, except for the shallow breath of a young bride. Outside, the murmur of a household waits. Servants, relatives, and neighbors lean forward in tense anticipation. In the flickering glow of torches, a white sheet lies prepared, not for comfort, but for proof. In this moment, her worth, her honor, even her family's future, balance on a single stain. This was the cruel theater of history's virginity tests. A ritual meant not for love, nor even for medicine, but for control. From medieval Europe to ancient India, from the harems of the Middle East to the royal courts of China, virginity was policed with methods at once shocking and humiliating. And tonight, we are stepping into that world. But before we begin, you're watching Whispers of History, where the past whispers its darkest secrets. Subscribe now, because what you're about to hear may change how you see history forever. Now, let's start. The obsession with virginity runs like a shadow through civilizations. In many cultures, a woman's value was bound to the idea of purity, a condition that men demanded but never had to prove themselves. The test was not medical, not scientific. It was a ritual, a performance, often designed more for society's satisfaction than for truth. The most infamous of these was the bloodstained sheet test. In medieval Europe, after a marriage was consummated, the bedsheet was inspected. A spot of blood was taken as proof of virginity, a public stamp of honor for the bride's family. Without it, shame could fall on the woman, suspicion on her virtue, and scandal on her kin. Yet anyone who knows the body understands the truth. Not all women bleed their first time. The sheet was never science. It was theater, one that left countless women branded unjustly. In ancient Rome, virginity was tied not only to marriage but to religion. The Vestal virgins, priestesses of Vesta, were sworn to chastity for 30 years. Their purity was considered essential for Rome's safety. If suspected of breaking their vow, brutal tests awaited them. Some sources suggest invasive examinations were carried out, though far more often, mere accusation was enough. Those found guilty, whether truly or falsely, were buried alive. Here, virginity wasn't just a family's concern. It was bound to the survival of an empire. But Europe and Rome were not alone. In the Middle East, physicians developed methods that claimed to prove virginity. Manuals described inspecting the tightness of the body, even the sound of urine flow, as supposed indicators of purity. None of this was reliable, but it shows how far people went to codify control. In some harems, eunuchs or midwives were tasked with examinations before women were admitted into a ruler's bed. To imagine the humiliation of standing before strangers, judged not for character but for a myth, is to understand the brutality of these rituals. And in South Asia, virginity was tied to honor through tests no less harsh. Ancient Ayurvedic texts mention the so-called two-finger test, where a physician would insert fingers to judge laxity. This practice, astonishingly, echoed through centuries and was only officially condemned in modern India in the 21st century. Here we see the endurance of myth over truth, superstition over dignity. Yet virginity testing was not always about examination. Sometimes it was ritualistic. In certain African tribes, women were subjected to ceremonies where elders declared their purity. Failure could mean rejection, banishment, or worse. These rituals were public, not private, a communal judgment on a woman's worth. The common thread in all these practices is clear. Virginity tests were less about biology and more about power. They served men, families, empires, religions. They transformed intimacy into proof, love into trial, and womanhood into property. But here's the haunting part. Despite the brutality, these tests were often cloaked in sensuality. The act of proof, the sheet, the inspection, the ritual, was framed as sacred, even celebratory. In medieval bridal chambers, the bloody sheet might be paraded through the streets as a banner of fertility and virtue. Guests cheered, families feasted. What for the woman was fear and humiliation, for society became spectacle. So ask yourself this: if you were that bride, lying on the bed as whispers gathered outside, would you pray for the sheet to bear its mark? Or would you rage against the injustice of being judged at all? That's the world we've stepped into, and it only gets darker. Because the history of virginity testing is not only about marriage, it's about law, punishment, and sometimes survival itself. The obsession with proof did not remain locked in bridal chambers or hidden temples. It seeped into royal courts, law codes, and public scandals. In some cases, virginity tests determined not just a woman's honor, but the fate of kingdoms. Consider the medieval monarchies of Europe. A queen's body was not her own. It was the foundation of dynasties. If she failed to prove her virginity on her wedding night, whispers spread like wildfire. Was the king deceived? Were heirs legitimate? In 16th century France, physicians were summoned to inspect noble brides accused of impurity. These examinations were invasive, humiliating, and often biased. A doctor's word could make or break a queen. Imagine the terror of standing before men who would declare, with cold authority, whether you were pure enough to wear a crown. One infamous case shook the Tudor court. Catherine of Aragon, first wife of Henry VIII, had been previously married to his brother, Arthur. When Henry sought to annul their marriage, he claimed Catherine had not been a virgin when they wed. She swore Arthur had never consummated the union, and physicians were called to weigh in. The debate over her virginity became not just a private issue, but the spark for England's break from the Catholic Church. A single question: had she or hadn't she reshaped the course of European history? But the cruelty did not end with queens. Ordinary women, too, were dragged before courts to prove their chastity. In Renaissance Europe, virginity tests were sometimes used in trials of rape. Rather than examining the accused man, physicians examined the woman. If her hymen was intact, her testimony might be doubted. If not, shame fell on her, regardless of consent. The victim became the accused, her dignity crushed under the weight of superstition disguised as science. Witch trials added another layer of brutality. In 17th century Europe, suspected witches were often examined for devil's marks, but virginity also came under scrutiny. A woman deemed to loose was more easily branded a servant of Satan. Midwives and priests were called to judge the state of her body. Virginity was not just purity, it was weaponized as evidence of guilt. And what of the Middle East? In the harems of Ottoman sultans, virginity was carefully policed. Young women selected for service or concubinage were inspected by senior eunuchs or midwives. A woman who failed might be dismissed, sold, or relegated to lesser roles. For those who passed, the test was their entrance ticket to lives of both privilege and captivity. Here, virginity was currency, proof not of innocence, but of value to a ruler's court. The cruelty crossed into modernity too. In 19th century Europe and America, physicians published manuals on how to verify virginity. They wrote of inspecting the hymen, measuring tightness, even judging by the sound of a woman's voice. These methods were pseudoscience at best, voyeurism at worst, yet they were accepted as medical authority, leaving countless women exposed to shame and violation in the name of truth. Perhaps most chilling was the endurance of the so-called two-finger test in South Asia, mentioned earlier. Colonial authorities even adopted it as part of criminal investigations. For victims of sexual violence, this meant facing not justice, but another assault disguised as examination. Only in the 21st century did human rights courts finally denounce it as unscientific and degrading. But its long shadow proves how deeply myths about virginity sank into law and culture. The brutality of these tests was often hidden beneath ceremony. In many cultures, the proof of virginity was staged as celebration. Families paraded bloodstained sheets through villages, women sang songs of purity, and entire communities feasted as if one body's pain was everyone's honor. For the bride, it was terror. For the crowd, it was entertainment. The dissonance is staggering. What was for her a trial of fear became for others a festival of pride. Yet amid all this, women sometimes fought back with ingenuity. Some brides used animal blood or pricked their fingers to stain sheets, ensuring proof when their bodies offered none. Others bribed midwives or physicians to declare them intact. In rare cases, sympathetic healers fabricated hymens using herbal concoctions or surgical tricks. These acts of quiet rebellion show that even under suffocating control, women sought ways to reclaim their dignity. Still, the power imbalance was immense. Men were never asked for proof of virginity. Their worth was measured in land, wealth, or lineage, never in their bodies. Virginity tests were a cage built only for women, a cage reinforced by culture, religion, medicine, and law. And yet, there is something haunting in how sensuality was twisted into spectacle. The bridal chamber, a space meant for intimacy, was transformed into a courtroom. The marriage bed, a place of union, became an altar of judgment. Virginity tests blurred the line between the private and the public, turning desire into evidence and intimacy into trial. So here's the question. If history built entire dynasties, court cases, and accusations on the fragile myth of virginity, what does that say about our past? And more disturbingly, what shadows of those myths linger still in our present? Because in the next part, we'll dive even deeper into the global history of virginity testing, from China's dynastic courts to tribal Africa, from the sensual rituals of fertility cults to the medical gaze of colonial empires. And we'll uncover why, despite its cruelty, the myth of virginity proved almost impossible to kill. The story of virginity tests does not belong to one continent. It threads through the world, adapting itself to cultures, empires, and tribes, each wrapping it in their own rituals and justifications. If in Europe it was the stained sheet, and in South Asia the two-finger test, in China, Africa, and beyond it took on forms no less invasive, no less cruel. In imperial China, virginity was a cornerstone of family honor. A bride was expected to enter her husband's household pure, and the proof often lay in her body. Midwives, sometimes even older relatives, examined her before marriage, inspecting the hymen as if it were a certificate of authenticity. In some dynastic courts, disputes over a bride's chastity could lead to annulment, exile, or worse. Concubines chosen for emperors were inspected by officials, their bodies scrutinized as instruments of political power. The woman's body, once again, became not her own, but a vessel of family, prestige, and dynastic continuity. Poets and painters cloaked this obsession in sensual imagery. Scrolls depicted pale brides with downcast eyes, framed as flowers yet to be plucked. But behind this art lay a harsher truth. Virginity was demanded, enforced, and tested. A woman who failed was shamed, dismissed, sometimes driven to suicide. Her fate hinged not on her talents, her mind, or her loyalty, but on the fragile myth of an unbroken membrane. In Japan, though the historical record is subtler, virginity was also tied to family honor. Samurai clans prized the chastity of their daughters as guarantees of alliances. And in Shinto rituals, purity itself was a spiritual state, one linked not only to the body but to the sacred order of society. Here, virginity tests were less clinical, more ritualistic, but their weight on women's lives was no less crushing. Across the seas, in Africa, traditions varied widely, but many shared the same theme: virginity as proof of honor and fertility. In certain tribes, girls underwent public ceremonies where elders or midwives declared them pure. Sometimes, the tests were symbolic, like drinking from a calabash or walking with poise across a mat. In other cases, they were invasive. Women who failed risked rejection, public shaming, or being deemed unworthy of marriage. Yet these ceremonies, like so many others, were not medical. They were theatrical, ritualistic, ways for communities to police women's bodies. In Ethiopia and Eritrea, families celebrated proof of virginity with songs and parades, much like Europe's stain sheet rituals. For the girl, the moment was filled with fear. For the village, it was a cause for celebration. The communal nature of these ceremonies shows how deeply ingrained the obsession was. A private act turned into public judgment, a woman's body transformed into the stage of honor. In the Middle East, echoes of virginity testing persisted in both ancient and modern practices. Medical manuals from the Islamic Golden Age described signs that supposedly revealed purity, from the tightness of muscles to the tone of a woman's skin. These were pseudo-scientific, but they reflected a cultural insistence on control. In rural communities, some families still demanded evidence on the wedding night, parading sheets or garments to prove the bride's virtue. What science debunked, culture clung to. Even in Polynesian islands, oral traditions speak of elders testing girls before marriage, though in symbolic rather than medical ways. The goal was always the same: to ensure purity before union, to mark women as vessels of continuity, honor, and fertility. What is striking in all these examples is the sheer persistence of the myth. Different lands, different gods, different dynasties. Yet the ritual remained. Virginity tests became a universal script, rewritten across continents, always casting women in the same role: the examined, the judged, the controlled. And while these practices were cloaked in sacred language, they often carried a sensual undertone. In poetry, virginity was compared to unopened blossoms, untouched snow, sealed treasure. Men celebrated the idea of claiming what others had not, turning purity into a prize. The imagery was seductive, but behind the metaphors lay humiliation, pain, and the stripping of agency. Even worse, virginity tests often decided more than marriages. They could determine inheritances, alliances, even survival. A woman accused of failing might lose her dowry, leaving her family disgraced. A queen judged impure might see her children declared illegitimate. A concubine dismissed as spoiled might be sold or cast aside. Intimacy became law, desire became politics, and purity became power. And here is where the brutality sharpens. Virginity was never demanded of men. Across cultures, from Rome to China, from Africa to Arabia, male desire was celebrated, excused, or ignored. Virginity tests were cages built only for women, proof demanded only from them. In this, the practice reveals less about love and more about control, about patriarchies constructing systems to bind women's bodies to men's honor. Yet, despite this weight, women sometimes found ways to resist. In parts of North Africa, brides carried pouches of chicken blood to stain sheets. In China, secret ointments were said to mimic the appearance of intact virginity. In Europe, herbal remedies claimed to tighten the body, restoring the illusion of purity. These tricks were desperate acts of survival, ways to navigate systems stacked against them. They also prove a quiet truth. Women never fully accepted the cruelty. They adapted, resisted, and subverted, even if history rarely recorded their voices. So what do these global practices reveal? That virginity testing was not an isolated tradition, but a near-universal obsession. It wore many masks: ritual, ceremony, medicine, honor, but always it was built on myth, never science, and its impact was devastating, branding countless women as failures for a standard that was impossible to measure. Which leaves us with a haunting question. Why did the myth prove so enduring? Why did cultures so different in religion, geography, and language all cling to the same falsehood? The answer may lie in power itself. Because to control a woman's body, to claim the right to examine, to test, to judge, was to control her life. And in societies where family, inheritance, and honor rested on women's sexuality, virginity tests became the cruelest tool of domination. In the next part, we'll look closer at the medicalization of virginity in the modern era, how 18th and 19th century doctors wrapped superstition in the cloak of science, turning tests into examinations that still haunt women today. And we'll ask, if science knew the truth, why did it remain silent? By the dawn of the Enlightenment, the world was changing. Telescopes mapped the heavens, microscopes revealed the invisible, and medicine claimed to separate truth from myth. But when it came to virginity, science did not free women from superstition. It dressed that superstition in a white coat and called it knowledge. In 18th and 19th century Europe, physicians published manuals describing how to prove virginity. They wrote of the hymen as a seal, a fragile veil whose presence or absence was supposed to determine purity. Some doctors claimed they could tell a virgin simply by looking at her. Others developed more invasive methods, examining tightness, elasticity, even the angle of the pelvis. The body was transformed into a case study, its most private parts catalogued like botanical specimens. These examinations were not confined to books. In courts of law, physicians were summoned to testify. A woman accused of immorality, rape, or adultery might be subjected to a clinical inspection, her dignity stripped away in the name of evidence. Judges listened not to her words, but to the pronouncements of men in black coats. And though medical knowledge was expanding, most of it ignored what midwives had long known: that the hymen was no guarantee of virginity, that bodies varied, that bleeding was never universal. Yet science chose silence. Why? Because to question the myth of virginity was to question a cornerstone of social order. Easier, safer, to reinforce the lie. The medicalization of virginity also became a colonial weapon. European empires carried their tests abroad, imposing them on colonized women as part of criminal investigations. In British India, physicians used the two-finger test to determine whether rape had occurred. The logic was twisted. If the body appeared accustomed to penetration, consent was assumed. Victims of violence were accused of impurity, their trauma compounded by invasive inspections. This so-called science was not protection. It was another form of violation. In Africa, missionaries introduced European ideas of virginity alongside Christian morality. Communities that had once celebrated fertility and childbirth rituals were now told to measure chastity in the European way. Hymens became a focus, examinations became common, and the obsession with proof tightened its grip. What had once been ritualistic or symbolic was now medical, invasive, and often enforced by colonial courts. The cruelty reached into asylums and prisons. In the Victorian era, young women deemed promiscuous or fallen were sometimes examined in institutions. Doctors claimed to detect their histories in the state of their bodies. Some were subjected to forced gynecological procedures, justified as treatment for hysteria or moral weakness. Their sexuality was pathologized, their purity medicalized, their resistance ignored. And yet, amid this brutality, whispers of doubt began to surface. A few physicians, particularly women entering the profession in the 19th century, questioned the validity of virginity tests. They pointed out that the hymen varied greatly, that many women did not bleed during first intercourse, that the body could not bear witness to morality. But their voices were drowned by centuries of authority and the weight of patriarchy. What makes this period so chilling is the veneer of objectivity. In earlier times, virginity tests had been rituals, often theatrical, their arbitrariness clear. But now, cloaked in the language of science, they gained new authority. A physician's word carried the weight of fact, even when it was based on ignorance or bias. The same myths persisted, only now they were harder to challenge. Consider the French courts of the 19th century. Physicians testified in trials, declaring women virgins or not with supposed certainty. Families hired doctors to inspect brides before marriage, seeking certificates of purity. Virginity became not only a matter of honor, but a bureaucratic document, signed and sealed. Imagine the humiliation of receiving a certificate that reduced your identity to a single judgment on your body. And yet there was a strange sensuality in how these medical texts described women. They spoke of soft tissues, delicate veils, hidden folds, language that straddled the line between clinical and erotic. Doctors who claimed objectivity often betrayed curiosity, even desire, in their detailed descriptions. The gaze of science was not free from the same voyeurism that had driven ritual tests for centuries. The colonial world echoed this paradox. In North Africa, French authorities subjected women to examinations before allowing marriages, claiming to protect soldiers from dishonor. In the Caribbean, enslaved women were inspected not only for labor but for chastity, their sexuality reduced to property. The blending of medicine, law, and empire created a web of control that extended across continents. And here lies the haunting truth. The more science advanced, the more virginity tests endured. Instead of debunking the myth, doctors gave it new life. The instruments of examination, gloves, speculums, charts, became the modern face of an ancient obsession. Still, women resisted. Some forged medical certificates, bribed physicians, or found sympathetic doctors willing to declare them pure. Others sought surgical procedures to reconstruct hymen, a practice that began in the 19th century and continues today under the name hymenoplasty. These were acts of survival in a world where purity could determine marriage, honor, even freedom. By the early 20th century, whispers grew louder. Feminists and reformers began to challenge the very idea of virginity testing. They argued that the obsession was rooted not in biology but in patriarchy. Yet even as they fought, the practice remained, stubborn, enduring. Courts still demanded proof, families still celebrated sheets, and colonial governments still wielded examinations as tools of judgment. So we are left with a question. If science knew better, why did it fail to protect women? Why did physicians, who prided themselves on progress, cling to myths that harmed those they examined? Perhaps because virginity testing was never truly about truth. It was about control, and science, like religion and law before it, became another instrument of that control. In the next part, we trace the 20th century and beyond, from the persistence of virginity testing in modern courts, armies, and schools, to the rise of resistance movements demanding its end. And we'll uncover how the shadow of this ancient practice still falls across our world today. The 20th century promised liberation. Nations rose, women fought for the right to vote, new technologies reshaped the world. But when it came to virginity, the past proved stubborn. The same tests that had haunted brides in medieval Europe and concubines in imperial courts resurfaced in hospitals, schools, and armies. Old myths dressed themselves in modern uniforms. In many countries, virginity testing became a state tool. Military regimes in parts of the Middle East and Africa forced female recruits to undergo examinations. The claim was always the same: to ensure morality, discipline, and purity in the ranks. In reality, it was humiliation dressed as procedure. Women were lined up, inspected by doctors or officers, judged not on skill or loyalty but on the condition of their bodies. Some who failed were expelled, others shamed, their careers destroyed before they began. The uniform did not protect them, it exposed them. Schools, too, became stages of inspection. In parts of Indonesia, students were subjected to virginity tests before graduation, a practice justified as promoting moral behavior. Girls feared not exams in mathematics or literature, but the hands of officials prying into their most private selves. Failure could mean suspension, rejection, even expulsion. Education, supposedly a path to empowerment, became another gatekeeper of purity. The cruelty extended to law enforcement. In North Africa, police sometimes demanded virginity tests of women detained on suspicion of prostitution or immorality. Courts accepted medical certificates as evidence, ignoring the unreliability of the practice. In some cases, victims of sexual violence were forced to undergo examinations to prove their claims, only to have the results turned against them. Instead of justice, the test became another violation. Perhaps most chilling were the tests performed in South Asia during the late 20th century. The two-finger test, condemned for centuries, persisted in hospitals and courts. Women reporting rape were examined not to confirm their trauma, but to question their purity. If deemed habituated, their testimony was doubted. The victim became suspect, her body once again transformed into evidence against her. It was not until the early 21st century that courts in India and Pakistan formally denounced the practice, but even then, its shadow lingered in rural clinics and police stations. The persistence of virginity testing in modern institutions reveals a deeper truth. The obsession with purity was never simply about tradition. It was about power. By making women prove their worth through their bodies, states and societies maintained control, turning intimacy into a political weapon. And yet, resistance began to grow louder. Feminist movements of the 20th century placed virginity testing under scrutiny. Activists in Europe and America exposed the pseudoscience behind it, while campaigners in Asia and Africa highlighted its cruelty. Reports from human rights organizations documented case after case of humiliation, showing the world that these were not isolated practices, but global injustices. In the 1960s and 70s, as sexual revolutions swept across the West, the very concept of virginity began to unravel. Writers and scholars challenged the idea that purity defined a woman's worth. Feminists argued that virginity tests were not only unscientific, but fundamentally oppressive. Yet even as the myth weakened in some societies, it remained entrenched in others. Consider the paradox. In cities like Paris or New York, young women celebrated sexual freedom, while in villages across Africa or South Asia, brides still faced inspections on their wedding nights. The world was split. Liberation in some places, chains in others. But perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: virginity testing did not merely survive. In some cases, it evolved. In wealthier societies, surgical clinics began offering hymen reconstruction procedures. Women who feared being judged sought surgery to restore the illusion of virginity. Hymenoplasty promised to erase the past, to create the proof society demanded. It was marketed as empowerment, but in reality, it revealed the same old chains so powerful that women paid to reforge them. At the same time, technology entered the conversation. Some families began demanding medical certificates of virginity before marriage. Echoing the 19th century European obsession with official proof, doctors signed documents attesting to purity, knowing full well the science was meaningless. The certificate, like the sheet before it, was theatre, only now stamped with a doctor's seal. And still, the rituals of old persisted. In parts of Eastern Europe and the Balkans, brides were expected to produce blood-stained sheets. In Middle Eastern villages, wedding nights were still spectacles of proof. In African tribes, ceremonial inspections continued. It seemed the world could not let go of this obsession, no matter how loudly science and activism denounced it. Yet women found new ways to resist. Activists organized campaigns, demanding governments ban virginity testing. Survivors spoke out, sharing their stories despite shame and stigma. Feminist lawyers challenged the admissibility of virginity exams in courts, exposing their unreliability. Slowly, cracks appeared in the walls of tradition. By the end of the 20th century, global organizations began to take notice. The World Health Organization declared virginity testing unscientific and harmful. The United Nations condemned it as a violation of human rights. Reports detailed its lasting psychological scars, anxiety, depression, trauma. But even with these declarations, the practice did not vanish. Like an old ghost, it lingered in hospitals, police stations, and bedrooms. And so we are left with a bitter irony. In a century that split the atom, walked on the moon, and mapped the human genome, women were still being judged by the false promise of a broken membrane. Virginity testing revealed not progress but persistence, the stubborn endurance of myths stronger than science, stronger than reason. But as the 20th century gave way to the 21st, resistance would grow louder still. From courtroom battles to viral campaigns, from brave survivors to international watchdogs, the demand for an end to virginity testing became a global movement. The question is, why, despite exposure and condemnation, does the practice refuse to die? In the next part, we'll explore the 21st century, where virginity testing has been outlawed in many nations but still carried out in secret. We'll uncover how technology, migration, and modern anxieties fuel its survival. And we'll ask, is the myth of virginity truly fading, or does it still hold us in ways we don't always see? The 21st century arrived with the promise of progress. International charters declared human rights universal, and medical science marched forward with new precision. Virginity testing, many assumed, belonged to the dustbin of history. But like a ghost clinging to the living, it refused to vanish. Even now, in a world of smartphones and satellites, women in many societies are still asked to prove their purity. In South Asia, despite court rulings and medical condemnation, the two-finger test lingered in rural clinics and police stations well into the 2010s. Survivors of sexual violence reported not only their trauma, but the added humiliation of being examined by doctors who claimed to measure their worth by their bodies. It took repeated judgments by the Supreme Courts of India and Pakistan, coupled with tireless activism, to push governments toward outlawing the practice. Yet enforcement remained uneven. Laws changed, but culture did not always follow. In Indonesia, virginity tests on female police recruits sparked international outrage as recently as the 2010s. Officials insisted the examinations were necessary for discipline and morality, though they had no scientific basis. After pressure from human rights groups, the practice was denounced. Yet reports suggested it persisted quietly, away from the eyes of journalists. What had once been paraded as pride now survived in whispers, hidden but not erased. In the Middle East, traditions around virginity carried into the new millennium. In some villages, brides were still expected to produce proof of bleeding on their wedding night. Families demanded medical certificates from doctors, who often complied despite knowing the science was meaningless. Clinics advertised virginity testing discreetly, offering not only certificates, but also surgeries like hymenoplasty. In a twist of modern irony, women turned to technology and medicine not to escape the myth, but to survive it. Even in the West, where sexual liberation was celebrated, the obsession resurfaced in subtle ways. Clinics in Europe and North America quietly offered virginity restoration procedures for immigrant families seeking to preserve honor. Women, trapped between new freedoms and old traditions, turned to surgery as a bridge. Hymenoplasty became a booming industry, marketed in glossy brochures as empowerment, though its very existence testified to the weight of cultural expectations. The global market responded. By the 2020s, online retailers sold so-called artificial hymens, capsules filled with blood-like liquid that women could insert before marriage to simulate proof. These products promised safety from suspicion, but they also revealed the desperation of those still judged by outdated rituals. In bedrooms around the world, the old stain sheet tradition lived on, only now supported by e-commerce. But virginity testing wasn't only about marriage. In some countries, it continued to serve as a tool of law enforcement. Reports emerged of women in North Africa and the Middle East being subjected to tests after being detained by police. The supposed goal was to establish whether they were moral or immoral. In reality, it was intimidation, a way of exerting power cloaked in medical procedure. The international community responded with growing outrage. The World Health Organization reiterated that virginity tests had no scientific validity and caused lasting psychological harm. The United Nations called them a form of gender-based violence. Human rights groups launched global campaigns, urging governments to ban the practice. Some countries responded with legislation, criminalizing virginity tests in hospitals and courts. Yet, even as bans spread, the practice endured. Why? Because virginity testing was never just about science or law. It was about culture, tradition, fear, and power. Families, driven by honor, still demanded proof. Communities still equated purity with worth. And in places where law clashed with tradition, tradition often won. The persistence of virginity tests in the 21st century reveals a paradox. On one hand, we live in an era of unprecedented knowledge. We know the hymen is not a reliable indicator of sexual history. We know the tests are inaccurate, harmful, and humiliating. On the other hand, societies cling to them, driven by anxieties about control, honor, and identity. Virginity, though biologically meaningless, remains symbolically powerful, and here lies the sensual undercurrent. In many cultures, virginity is framed as a treasure, a flower, a sealed book. The language is poetic, alluring, but behind the poetry lies pressure, fear, and violence. The romantic imagery of purity is a mask for control. It is intimacy weaponized, love transformed into judgment. But resistance has never been stronger. Survivors share their stories online, exposing the cruelty of virginity testing to global audiences. Activists campaign in parliaments, demanding not only laws, but cultural change. Feminist writers dismantle the myths in essays, books, and viral posts. Medical professionals refuse to perform the tests, declaring them unethical. Each act chips away at the edifice of tradition, weakening its hold. In some countries, change has been swift. Sweden, Canada, and South Africa outlawed virginity testing outright, framing it as a violation of human rights. Courts in India and Pakistan banned the two-finger test, declaring it degrading and irrelevant. Even in conservative societies, younger generations began questioning the practice, using social media to spark conversations once deemed taboo. And yet, the battle is not over. Virginity tests remain in practice across parts of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. They persist not because they are true, but because they serve power. The power of families to control daughters, of states to discipline women, of communities to police morality. So here is the uncomfortable truth. In the 21st century, virginity testing exists not in spite of progress, but alongside it. It lives in the shadows of hospitals, in whispered demands before weddings, in the quiet transactions between families and doctors. It has not vanished. It has adapted. Which brings us to the present moment. If history shows us anything, it is that myths are resilient. They bend, reshape, and disguise themselves, but they do not die easily. Virginity testing has survived religion, empire, science, and law. Will it also survive our century? In the final part, we'll confront this question head-on. We'll explore the legacy of virginity testing, the scars it leaves, and the movements fighting to erase it from history. And we'll ask, if purity is a myth, what happens when the world finally admits it? For thousands of years, the idea of virginity has been less a truth than a myth, a story societies told to control women's bodies, their choices, and their futures. From the stained sheets of medieval Europe to the two-finger test in modern South Asia, from the harems of the Ottomans to the clinics of the 21st century, the demand for proof has echoed across time. The methods have changed, but the core has remained the same. Intimacy transformed into trial, love turned into evidence, and purity made into property. What makes this history so haunting is its endurance. Cultures rose and fell, empires collapsed, religions shifted, science advanced, and still, the same obsession endured. Men were never asked to prove their worth through their bodies. Women, again and again, with virginity testing reveals less about biology than about power, about who is allowed to control and who must submit. The scars of these practices run deep. Generations of women lived in fear of failure, not because of what they did, but because of what their bodies could or could not show. Many were punished unjustly, shamed, even executed. Others sought desperate tricks: chicken, blood, ointments, surgeries, certificates, not to deceive, but to survive. Imagine the weight of living in a world where a single night, a single sheet, could determine your honor forever. And yet, even within this cruelty, we see resilience. Women resisted in whispers and in silence, in rebellion and in defiance. They found ways to navigate the traps laid before them. And in the modern age, they spoke out louder than ever, exposing the lie for what it was. Virginity testing is not science. It never was. It is myth, ritual, performance, masquerading as truth. The sensuality of the myth made it alluring. Virginity was dressed in the language of flowers and treasures, of unopened doors and sealed vessels. Poets sang of it, painters imagined it, lovers claimed it. But beneath the poetry lay brutality. The same sheet paraded as proof of fertility was also a banner of humiliation. The same medical exam claimed as protection was also a form of violation. The sensual and the savage were never far apart. So what is the legacy of virginity testing today? On one hand, we see hope. International organizations condemn the practice. Governments outlaw it. Doctors refuse to perform it. Survivors share their voices. Movements rise to end it once and for all. The myth has been stripped bare, its falsehood exposed. On the other hand, we see shadows. In secret clinics, tests are still performed. In hidden bedrooms, brides still fear the sheet. In some communities, honor is still chained to purity, and families still demand proof. The ghost remains, lingering in whispers, in rituals, in fear. The question then is not only whether virginity testing will die, but whether society is willing to let go of the myth that sustains it. Because as long as virginity is seen as property, as currency, as proof, the pressure will remain. The test may change form, but the obsession will survive. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. History shows us not only the cruelty of the past, but its persistence. Myths are stubborn. They are hard to kill. But history also shows us that myths can be unmasked, resisted, undone. Just as women in the past found ways to trick the sheets or silence the doctors, so too can we find ways to bury the myth itself. So I leave you with a question. If virginity has no medical truth, if the tests are false, if the rituals were always performance, why do we still cling to the idea at all? What is it about purity, about proof, that societies fear losing? And what might the world look like if we finally let it go? Because perhaps the true test is not for women, but for us. Can we move beyond the myths we inherited? Can we build a future where intimacy belongs not to courts, doctors, or families, but to individuals themselves? That is the brutal truth about virginity tests in history. They were never about the body. They were about control. And until that control is broken, the ghost of the test will remain. You've been listening to Whispers of History. If this journey through the forbidden and the forgotten moved you, subscribe and join us again. Because history is never silent. It whispers in every custom, every ritual, every myth we carry forward. And only by listening can we learn how to finally lay those ghosts to rest.